HOA Karen's patrol kicked down my door. Didn't know the FBI uses my property for live fire exercises. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where everything feels routine. I was lounging on the couch, the soft hum of the TV in the background. The sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The house was peaceful, almost too peaceful. It had been a while since anything out of the ordinary had happened around here, and for once I was grateful for it. I thought, maybe today will be just like every other day, just another moment of calm. But then the sound of shouting broke through the stillness. At first I thought it was nothing, a couple of neighbors arguing maybe, but the voices were getting louder, more urgent, and as I glanced through the window, I saw her, Karen. Of course, I thought, it had to be her. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was that one neighbor everyone has, the one who's always watching, always asking questions, always looking for something to complain about. If there was a leaf out of place or someone parked a little too close to the curb, Karen was there to report it. I had learned to steer clear of her, politely nod when we crossed paths, keep the conversations brief, and never, ever make eye contact for too long. But today, something was different. I could see her pacing in front of my front door, hands on her hips, her mouth moving as though she was yelling at someone, though I couldn't hear the words. And behind her, two figures in dark clothing, one of them holding a walkie-talkie. It seemed like some sort of patrol. What was going on? I felt my heart rate quicken as I watched. Karen was always dramatic, but this felt different. She looked frantic, as though she was directing some sort of operation. But why? What was she involved in now? Before I could make sense of it, I heard the unmistakable sound of my front door rattling. I froze. What the hell? And then, with an unnerving crack, the door burst open. I wasn't sure at first what was happening. The figures in dark clothing stormed inside, pushing past Karen as she stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mix of panic and urgency. I could barely process what I was seeing, but in a matter of seconds, I was face to face with two men who were clearly not your average visitors. My mind raced, trying to understand how this could be happening. Why were they breaking into my house, and why the hell was Karen involved? I stood there, mouth dry, hands shaking. The man closest to me, wearing a dark tactical vest and holding a gun, barked at me to step back. He didn't give an explanation, didn't say anything that made sense. He just moved with authority, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Karen, still standing in the doorway, looked on with an expression I couldn't quite place. It was almost like satisfaction, like she was watching a well-orchestrated plan unfold, one that she had been a part of all along. And then, just as I was about to ask what was going on, the man with the walkie-talkie stepped forward, his face grim. "You're not supposed to be here," I heard myself say, more out of reflex than anything else. He glanced at Karen, then back at me, before muttering, "FBI's orders." My stomach dropped. The FBI? In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life in this quiet neighborhood shattered. The man with the walkie-talkie barely acknowledged me as he moved to the back of the house, his footsteps heavy, purposeful. And Karen? She just stood there, her arms folded, eyes narrowed like she was waiting for something else to happen, something bigger. I couldn't help but wonder, what was going on? Why did the FBI need my house for whatever this was? Karen had always been difficult. When I first moved into this neighborhood, I was excited. Quiet streets, well-kept lawns, the occasional nod from neighbors, everything you'd expect in a suburban town. And then there was Karen. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was just another one of the faces you'd see around, someone to wave at when you took out the trash or watered the garden. But soon enough, I began to notice things, small things, like the way she'd appear at the exact moment I was mowing my lawn, watching from her window with a pair of binoculars in hand, or how she'd always find some excuse to stop by when I was outside, asking if I had any leftover boxes for a yard sale she was planning. At first, I brushed it off. I didn't want to make waves, but over time, those little visits started to feel less like coincidence and more like surveillance. It wasn't long before she started sending complaints to the homeowners association. The grass was too long. The fence needed a fresh coat of paint. I had a few chairs out on the porch, and Karen, who lived 2 houses down, decided they were a safety hazard. Every complaint was followed by a passive-aggressive note slid under my door. Or worse, an unsolicited visit from her, checking in to make sure everything was up to code. I'll admit, at first I was confused. Was she genuinely concerned about the neighborhood? Was she just trying to be helpful? But no matter how many times I tried to respond politely, to explain that things were fine and I didn't need her interference, she'd come back with another complaint, another suggestion, another little reminder that she was watching. I started to avoid her, of course. I didn't have the energy for her games. I would take different routes around the neighborhood, leave earlier or later to avoid running into her while I walked my dog, and shut the blinds when I sensed her lurking outside. It became this unspoken dance between us, me trying to live my life without her constant interruptions, and her finding new ways to involve herself in my business. But what really set the stage for what happened that day was her obsession with the property. It started small. One afternoon, as I was washing my car in the driveway, Karen appeared on the other side of the street. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood there, staring at my house. I tried to ignore her, but her gaze was so intense, it was hard not to feel it. Then she casually mentioned, "You know, you really should check the foundation. I saw a crack on the side of your house last week. Might be a serious problem." I chuckled nervously, trying to brush it off, but Karen didn't stop. "And that tree in your backyard? I think it's a safety hazard," she continued, her voice sharp. "It's too close to the power lines. I'd get rid of it if I were you." That was the first time it felt personal. She wasn't just giving advice. She was telling me how to manage my own home. And that wasn't normal. As the weeks passed, her remarks became more frequent, more insistent. She would knock on my door just to tell me that a bush was too tall or the street light near my house was flickering and that I should report it. But what was more unsettling was how specific her complaints were. She seemed to know details about my property that I hadn't shared with anyone. How did she know about the crack in the foundation before I even saw it? Or that the tree had been trimmed just last month? One night I was sitting on my porch and she walked by with her dog. She paused at the end of my driveway, looking down at the ground. I noticed her muttering something to herself, too quietly for me to hear clearly. When I asked if she needed anything, she quickly turned and walked away without saying a word. It was the strangest feeling, as though she was taking notes on everything, just waiting for the right moment to bring it all up again. But why? What was her end game? Things escalated further when, on a particularly hot summer evening, Karen came over with a folder in her hands. She explained that she had been doing some research on the neighborhood and that she thought it might be a good idea for me to consider installing a security system. She gave me a brochure, but there was something off about the whole conversation. It wasn't just advice. It felt like a demand. And I noticed almost too late that she had circled my house on the map of the neighborhood she brought along. "I just think you should be prepared," she said, in that calm, almost rehearsed tone of hers. "You never know what might happen around here. Best to be safe." It was around that time that I began to realize Karen wasn't just another busybody. She was watching, studying everything about me. She had an unhealthy interest in my life, in my house, in my every move. It wasn't just about lawn care or safety. It felt like she was compiling information for something much bigger. But what? I couldn't put my finger on it, but every interaction with her had a strange, unsettling weight to it. It was like she was laying the groundwork for something, and I couldn't figure out exactly what that was until it was too late. It all happened so fast. One second I was sitting on the couch trying to make sense of the strange noise I'd heard outside. The next there was a loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of my front door crashing against the wall. I froze. My heart leapt into my throat. I couldn't process what was happening. The door, my door, was lying in splinters on the ground, the handle twisted, the wood warped and shattered, and standing in the doorway, filling the frame with their imposing figures, were 2 men. No, not men. These were something else entirely, dressed head to toe in dark tactical gear, with weapons slung over their shoulders. They moved with the kind of precision I'd only ever seen in action movies. I stood up, my legs stiff, as if my body was still trying to understand what was going on. I opened my mouth, but the words didn't come out. I took a step forward, but something told me not to approach, not to get any closer. The man on the left turned his head slightly, glancing at me, but didn't speak. They just stood there, silent, looming, like statues waiting for orders. This isn't real. This can't be happening. My mind screamed at me, but my body wasn't listening. My hand reached for my phone, but it trembled so badly I could barely unlock it. It didn't take long for my confusion to turn into panic. The pieces didn't fit. I was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Karen, the door, the sudden appearance of these soldiers. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in, rushing through my veins, but my mind was struggling to keep up. Why were they here? What did they want? The man closest to me, broad-shouldered, wearing a helmet and looking every bit like someone who'd been trained for this, spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Stay back. This is an official operation." My mouth went dry. Official operation? What the hell was an official operation doing in my living room? I barely had time to process those words before I heard footsteps behind me. The second man had moved toward the back of the house. He didn't look at me. He just kept moving, like he knew exactly where to go. I turned to Karen. She was still standing in the doorway, a strange expression on her face. It wasn't fear or anger or even surprise. It was like satisfaction. She watched with this weird calmness as the men started to move through the house, as if this was something she had been expecting all along. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" I shouted, my voice breaking the silence. But she didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding inside. She wasn't even looking at me anymore. I took a step back, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. I had never seen these people before. They weren't local law enforcement. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen in my small, quiet town. The heavy gear, the precise movements, the lack of any badges or identification. This wasn't a typical police raid. I tried to get a closer look at one of the men, but he caught my gaze and immediately motioned for me to move away. His eyes were hidden behind a dark visor, but I could feel the cold authority behind them. I didn't argue. I couldn't. Everything about this screamed military. But what were they doing here? Why my house? I turned back to Karen, but she was already disappearing down the driveway, walking away like it was nothing. She didn't even look back. My breath quickened, and I had to steady myself on the wall to keep from collapsing. What the hell was going on? I walked cautiously to the wreckage of my door. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and every small sound, the men moving through the house, the faint beeping of a device somewhere in the back, seemed amplified. My thoughts were scrambled, like a broken radio trying to tune into a station that didn't exist. The more I tried to process it, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. But the worst part? The part that sent an icy chill down my spine? It was the realization that I wasn't dealing with some angry neighbor trying to assert control anymore. This was something far bigger. As the men moved through my house, I could see one of them placing what looked like small sensors near the windows. Another was scribbling something on a clipboard, writing things down with a practiced hand. They were so methodical. Too methodical. This wasn't just a random invasion of my privacy. And then it hit me like a punch to the gut. Karen. She had always been too interested in my property, too aware of everything, too involved. She had known something was coming. She had been a part of it. As I stood there, barely able to breathe, it became painfully clear that I wasn't just some confused homeowner caught in a weird misunderstanding. This wasn't about a petty neighbor dispute or an angry complaint about my lawn. This was something else entirely. Something dark, something far-reaching. And I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole went. The seconds that followed felt like hours. The men in tactical gear were still moving through the house, examining everything with cold precision. while I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, my mind spinning. The questions pounded in my head, each one more urgent than the last. Why my house? Why me? Why the FBI? I couldn't think straight. The door was ruined, my privacy shattered, and the very idea that these people were here, without any warning, without any explanation, was too much to handle. I stumbled toward the back door, still trying to make sense of it all, but the world around me seemed to blur. I needed answers. I had to know what was going on. That's when I remembered my phone, still shaking in my hand. I fumbled with the screen, almost dropping it in my panic, before I dialed the only number I could think of, my lawyer. But as I held the phone to my ear, I heard a voice behind me. "Stay where you are." It was one of the men, his voice sharp, clipped. I turned, but he didn't look at me. He was too busy adjusting a piece of equipment on the floor. His hand was steady, and his movements deliberate. He was treating my house like it was nothing more than a training ground, and I was the outsider, just in the way. I didn't listen. I needed to understand. I needed to know why. I bolted outside and into the yard, still in a daze when I noticed something strange. One of the men was standing near the fence, talking into his walkie-talkie. I crept closer, trying to hear the conversation, but all I caught were snippets of words: live fire drills, coordinates, and target area secured. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Live fire drills. My property. I stumbled back, trying to process what I had just heard. It made no sense. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The FBI on my property. For what purpose? As I stood there in the yard, the sounds of my once peaceful home now filled with the distant clatter of military-like operations. I had to force myself to breathe. Live fire exercises. What did that even mean? I thought of shooting ranges, of training camps in the middle of nowhere, not suburban homes surrounded by picket fences. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would the FBI need to use my property for such an operation? And why hadn't they told me? Why hadn't they asked? Why didn't they even warn me? The confusion quickly turned to anger. I walked back inside, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed answers. I grabbed the phone again, my fingers no longer trembling with fear, but with frustration. I called the local police department, hoping that at least one person there might have a clue. The conversation was short, and it didn't make things better. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no jurisdiction over federal operations. You'll have to contact the FBI directly." The coldness in their response only made me more furious. This was bigger than just Karen, bigger than me. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew this was something illegal, something dangerous. The idea that federal agents had used my home as a training ground, without my consent, was unfathomable. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like this had been going on for far longer than I realized. That's when the pieces started to fall into place. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She wasn't just a complainer. She was involved. She had known. She had always known what was happening. The strange things she'd said about my property, the way she'd always been overly concerned about every little detail. It wasn't just her being obsessive. She was part of something bigger. I paced back and forth, struggling to process everything I was beginning to realize. The FBI, why were they using my house for these drills? Why hadn't they obtained permission? What about my rights as a property owner? The legal questions flooded my mind, but none of them seemed to have a clear answer. I needed to know how long this had been going on. Was it just today, or had I been unknowingly hosting these live fire exercises for months? The thought of it made my stomach churn. What if I wasn't the only one? How many others were being used in these operations without their consent? And then there were the ethical questions. Shouldn't the government have to notify homeowners? Wasn't there some sort of law protecting private property from being commandeered for something like this? If the FBI could do this without warning or permission, what was to stop them from doing it again? Or worse, what else were they doing under the guise of training? I looked around my living room, the broken door still a stark reminder of the intrusion. Everything had changed. It wasn't just about the damage to my house anymore. It was about the violation of my rights. The FBI had used my home for their own purposes, without even bothering to ask. I couldn't help but feel like a pawn in some much bigger game, and as much as I wanted answers, I knew I was only scratching the surface of a situation that went far beyond anything I could have imagined. The more I thought about it, the more Karen's behavior seemed to fit into a larger, more unsettling puzzle. At first, I chalked up her constant involvement in my life to sheer nosiness, maybe a touch of obsession. But now, after everything that had happened, I couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that there was more to her than he had ever imagined. Why had she always been so fixated on my property? She'd never been this intrusive with any of the other neighbors. It wasn't just the casual complaints or the unsolicited advice. It was the way she always seemed to know too much. The details she'd pointed out about my house, the warnings about my foundation and trees. She'd always seemed a little too knowledgeable, too aware. It wasn't just the FBI's sudden appearance that made me question her role in all this. It was the way she reacted. When the men kicked down my door, when they stormed in like they owned the place, Karen didn't show a hint of surprise or fear. She didn't flinch when the door shattered or when the armed figures moved through the house. In fact, she stood there in the doorway, almost like she was waiting for it to happen, watching it unfold with that unreadable expression on her face. It didn't sit right with me. Could she have known? I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't just some innocent bystander. There was a cold calculation in the way she'd gone about things, the way she'd always hovered around, always found an excuse to be close to my property. She'd watched me for months, maybe even longer, always poking her nose into things I didn't ask for. But was it just because she was a concerned neighbor? Or was she working with someone? The thought rattled me, but it seemed too obvious to ignore. Maybe Karen wasn't just some eccentric busybody. Maybe she had been involved in the FBI's operations all along, whether as an informant or a collaborator. How else could she have known all the right details about my house, about the things that needed fixing, or about the security measures I should have taken? How else could she have been in the right place at the right time, every single time? But there was still a part of me that wasn't ready to fully accept that. Could she have just been caught in the crossfire? Had she been manipulated into thinking she was doing the right thing, helping the FBI with their unofficial operations? It was possible, I thought. Maybe Karen had no idea how deep this went. Maybe she'd been so focused on reporting every little thing about my house that she never asked the bigger questions. I started to replay every interaction I'd had with her, trying to pick apart the clues I'd missed. She'd always been too insistent, too sure of herself. Even when I politely declined her offers to help with things around the house, she'd press on. It was like she had a hidden agenda, one she wasn't telling me about. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that her actions didn't add up. Could she have been aware of the FBI's use of my property, even if she wasn't directly involved in the operation? What if she'd been working as some sort of middleman, passing along information to the agents, observing my behavior, reporting back to them? After all, she had access to my home. She'd been inside my property numerous times, had seen the layout of the rooms, knew where everything was. That was exactly the kind of intel a group like the FBI would need for their drills, wasn't it? And that cold satisfaction I'd seen in her eyes when the agents arrived, it wasn't the reaction of someone caught off guard. No, Karen wasn't shocked. She was prepared. I couldn't deny it anymore. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Karen wasn't just a random neighbor. She had a part to play in all this. Whether she was fully aware of it or not, her actions, her constant surveillance of my property, her odd obsession with every little detail, had put her in the perfect position to be involved. She had a role in this twisted game, whether she was pulling the strings or just following orders. But that didn't answer the big question. Why? What was Karen's motive in all this? Was she getting something out of it? Was she trying to protect me? Or was she just playing a game of power, enjoying the control she had over my life? I couldn't figure it out. Every time I thought I had her figured out, every time I thought I could pin down her intentions, the picture became murkier. Maybe she didn't care about me at all. Maybe it wasn't about me, but about something bigger, something she'd been lured into, willingly or not. And then, of course, there was the possibility that Karen wasn't working with the FBI at all. Maybe she had simply gotten too caught up in her own obsession, too wrapped up in watching and listening to every detail of my life. Maybe the agents had chosen my property for their operation, and she had been just as shocked as I was when they showed up. But even then, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she let on, that she had been involved long before I ever suspected anything was wrong. I had to know. I had to find out what Karen's role truly was. If she was working with the FBI, if she had been the one feeding them information about my home, it would change everything. It would change how I saw this entire situation. And if she wasn't? If she was just a pawn caught in the middle of something she didn't fully understand, well, that would be just as dangerous. I couldn't make sense of it. The adrenaline was still rushing through my veins, and every time I tried to think, it felt like my mind was being pulled in a dozen different directions. Fear, anger, disbelief. It was a mix of emotions so intense I could barely keep myself together. At first, there was nothing but shock. I stood in the wreckage of my living room, staring at the mess the FBI agents had left behind. The door, shattered beyond recognition. The house that had once felt like my safe place now seemed like a crime scene. I had no idea how to process what had just happened. The images of the men in tactical gear, their cold eyes, their precise movements, they kept replaying in my mind over and over again. It didn't feel real. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But it was, and I couldn't escape it. Then came the fear. It wasn't just about the physical invasion of my home. It was the sheer uncertainty of everything that had transpired. What had they been doing in my house? Why? The more I tried to understand, the more terrified I became. The FBI on my property? It was impossible to ignore the weight of it. What else had they done that I didn't know about? Were they still watching me? Listening? My privacy had been torn apart in an instant, and I had no control over any of it. My thoughts spiraled further into panic. I started questioning everything I'd ever done, every decision I'd made. Was I being watched? My mind kept racing, and I couldn't stop it. Then came the anger. It was a slow burn, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. The anger wasn't just at the FBI. It was at Karen, at the entire situation, at everything. I felt betrayed. My home, my sanctuary, had been violated by people I didn't even know, and possibly by someone I thought I knew. Karen's role in all of this was still a question mark, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how deep her involvement could be. The thought of her, calmly watching the whole thing unfold, made my blood boil. How could she do this to me? How could she betray me like this if she was really part of it all? I was furious and I wanted answers, but no one seemed to have any. The disbelief hit me like a wave. I kept asking myself, how could this happen? Why me? Why my house? It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The more I tried to rationalize what had happened, the more the world around me seemed like it had shifted into something unfamiliar. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. How could something like this happen so suddenly without warning? I thought I was just living my life, minding my own business. And then, out of nowhere, everything was turned upside down. How had I missed all the signs? Was I just too naive to see what was right in front of me? I tried to reach out to friends and family, but it didn't help. My brother picked up the phone first. I could hear the confusion in his voice as I tried to explain what had happened. He listened, but there was a long pause before he spoke again. Wait, what? The FB? You're sure? It wasn't disbelief in the sense of he didn't believe me, but disbelief that anyone could actually believe what I was saying. The idea of the FBI suddenly raiding someone's home, unannounced and without explanation, was too bizarre to process. He was probably just as confused as I was. He didn't know what to say, what to do, and neither did I. After a few minutes of awkward silence, he finally responded, but it wasn't the comfort I'd hoped for. You need to call a lawyer. I don't even know where to start with this. This doesn't sound right. I could feel the frustration in his voice. He wanted to help, but he couldn't. No one could. No one could tell me what to do or how to fix it. The FBI wasn't something you could just call up and ask for clarification. There were no easy answers. It wasn't like dealing with a broken appliance or a simple neighbor dispute. This was something bigger, something far beyond what I'd ever imagined. And the more I tried to explain it, the more I realized how unreal it sounded. When I spoke to my best friend later, the reaction was much the same. She was sympathetic, but as I explained the sequence of events, the shock in her voice was unmistakable. This sounds like something out of a movie. Are you sure you're not, I don't know, overreacting? I wanted to scream. Of course I wasn't overreacting. This wasn't just some overblown story in my head. My door had been kicked down. Armed men had invaded my home. I wasn't imagining this. But her question stung, and I could hear the doubt creeping into her words. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe it was easier to assume that I was overreacting than to admit that the unthinkable had actually happened. The hardest part was the challenge of piecing everything together. Each fragment of information, each new piece of the puzzle felt like it was just beyond my grasp. Every time I thought I understood one part of the situation, another question would arise. What exactly had the FBI been doing here? How long had this been going on? What was Karen's involvement? There were too many unanswered questions, and every time I tried to get closer to the truth, it seemed like it slipped further away. My emotions, fear, anger, confusion, kept clouding my judgment, and I couldn't figure out where to start. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, looking down into a dark abyss, with no way of knowing how deep it went. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, and every time I tried to make sense of it all, it felt like the ground beneath me kept shifting. The concept of live fire exercises is something most people don't think about on a day-to-day basis. It's not something that comes up in casual conversation, and for good reason. Live fire drills are high-stakes, dangerous operations that are carefully controlled in specific environments. But what most people don't know is that law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, use these exercises regularly to prepare for real-world situations. It's part of their training process, designed to simulate the chaos and unpredictability of real-life operations. In theory, live fire exercises help agents and officers hone their skills in a controlled, yet intense environment. They're meant to prepare them for everything, from hostage rescues to armed standoffs and everything in between. The idea is to create a realistic setting where agents can practice their tactics, perfect their response times, and simulate the risks they would face during an actual mission. But of course, that requires more than just a shooting range or a training facility. It requires a real-world environment, which is where the issue starts to get complicated. When the FBI or any other law enforcement agency conducts these exercises, they often need properties that closely mimic the types of environments they might encounter during real operations. It's not enough to practice on a controlled set or an abandoned building. They need real homes, real streets, real structures. The idea is that the unpredictability of a real home, furniture, hallways, rooms, and even a backyard, adds a level of realism that a simulated set can't provide. And sometimes those properties aren't necessarily on the outskirts of a city or in a remote area. Sometimes they're in suburban neighborhoods or residential areas like mine. But there's a problem. Conducting these operations on private property, especially without the owner's consent, is a massive legal and ethical gray area. It's one thing to use public spaces for training, but when it involves private homes, things become murkier. The FBI doesn't typically advertise where or when they'll be conducting these live fire exercises. They keep things as low-key as possible, often choosing locations without notifying residents, as was the case with me. There are several reasons why the FBI might avoid transparency in these situations. One of the biggest is the potential risk of a public backlash. Imagine the outcry if the public knew that the FBI was routinely conducting high-risk operations in residential areas, somewhere where people are supposed to feel safe. There's a real concern about how these exercises could affect local communities, not just in terms of the physical risk involved, but also the psychological toll it takes on residents who are unknowingly put in harm's way. The fear of armed, tactical teams storming through a neighborhood, gunshots echoing through the streets, windows shattering, the sound of sirens blaring, can be overwhelming for anyone who wasn't prepared for it. In my case, I was just living my life, unaware that my property had been marked for one of these exercises. The sudden appearance of armed agents kicking down my door without warning felt like a complete violation. What about the neighbors? What about the other families in the area who might have seen or heard what was happening? How many people had unknowingly been part of these drills without ever being told why? The risk of confusion, panic, and worse yet, injury is real when you're talking about firearms being discharged in populated areas. The FBI, of course, justifies these exercises as a necessary part of their work. They argue that they need real environments to train in, that it's crucial for the agents to experience high-pressure situations that mirror what they might face in the field. But this does little to alleviate the concerns of people like me who are living in those environments, unaware that we've been chosen as part of their training ground. What's even more concerning is the lack of communication from the FBI. I never received a letter, a warning, or even a hint that my property had been selected for such an exercise. The FBI doesn't typically involve the public in these decisions, often citing national security or operational security reasons. But at what cost? What about the legal rights of homeowners? What about the ethical responsibility of an agency that claims to protect the public? In their efforts to prepare for high-stakes situations, the FBI puts people like me in a position where we're left to pick up the pieces after they've come and gone, leaving destruction in their wake. The decision to use private property for these operations raises serious questions about the balance between national security and individual rights. Sure, the FBI's job is to protect the public and ensure safety. But at what point does their need for secrecy and realism infringe upon the lives of the very people they're meant to protect? When I looked around my home after the agents left, I didn't feel protected. I felt like I'd been used, like I was just another asset in their training program, something to be exploited for the sake of their mission. The reality of live-fire exercises is that they're dangerous and unpredictable. They carry the risk of collateral damage, both physical and emotional. And when they are conducted in areas where civilians are completely unaware of what's happening, the consequences can be severe. No one wants to be caught in the middle of a military-style operation, especially when they had no say in the matter. Yet for the FBI, it seems the necessity of realism trumps the needs of individuals like me. So, while the FBI may have legitimate reasons for conducting these exercises, the lack of transparency and the blatant disregard for private property rights is hard to justify. In the end, it's the residents, the innocent people, who bear the brunt of these decisions. The question remains, how far is too far when it comes to national security, and where do we draw the line between protecting the public and violating personal freedoms? The moment I understood what had happened, that the FBI had used my property for their live fire exercises without my knowledge or consent, I was faced with a whirlwind of questions. Legally, I had to wonder, what are my rights? Wasn't my home supposed to be protected from intrusion? What could I do to hold them accountable? And ethically, the situation felt even more unsettling. Could the government really just use a private citizen's property for training exercises without any regard for the law or the owner's wishes? It felt like a violation of everything I believed a democracy should stand for. The legal implications were far-reaching. As a property owner, I had certain fundamental rights that, in theory, protected me from having my space invaded without proper cause. The Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. Under normal circumstances, any law enforcement agency, including the FBI, would be required to get a warrant or seek permission before entering or using someone's private property. But in this case, no warrant had been issued. No permission had been asked. It seemed like a blatant violation of my rights, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there should be some legal recourse. Could I sue? At first, I wasn't sure. The FBI, as a government agency, enjoys certain immunities when it comes to lawsuits. They can be sued, but it's not always straightforward. In cases where there's an alleged violation of constitutional rights, like in this case, it's possible to bring a suit under a legal theory known as Bivens actions, named after a landmark Supreme Court case. This would allow me to sue individual FBI agents for violating my rights, assuming there was a clear constitutional violation. But this route wasn't simple. It would involve navigating the complicated layers of federal law and government immunity, not to mention a lengthy and costly legal battle. But even if I could get a lawsuit off the ground, would I win? Could I prove that the FBI's actions were unjustifiable? There were so many questions about whether the FBI had any legal standing to conduct these operations without informing the property owners. If the FBI had simply obtained a warrant for training purposes, that could potentially give them the legal right to use private land. However, the lack of transparency and the way this situation had unfolded made it clear that there was no official procedure or communication. The agents had shown up unannounced, kicked down my door, and essentially turned my home into a training ground, without any explanation. I felt the frustration of being caught in a system where the rules weren't clear and the consequences were enormous. And then there were the ethical questions. Was it right for a government agency to use someone's private property as a training location without permission? Shouldn't property owners have a say in how their land is used, especially when it comes to potentially dangerous operations? The ethical dilemma felt stark. On one hand, the FBI might argue that they were conducting necessary exercises for national security or public safety. After all, they needed realistic environments to train in. But on the other hand, where was the respect for individual rights? Why should I be forced into the role of an unwilling participant in something I didn't even know was happening? The ethical issue grew more complicated the more I thought about it. There's a reason we have property laws in this country. They're meant to protect citizens from exactly this kind of overreach. No one should be forced into this position where their home becomes a government training ground, especially when they're completely unaware that it's happening. Beyond the legal ramifications, there was a moral question here. Was it ethical for the government to operate in such a manner? As I dug deeper into this, I realized there might be a loophole the FBI could exploit. One possibility was the concept of implied consent. If a property owner doesn't take action when they're aware their land is being used for a government purpose, or if they don't contest it in a reasonable amount of time, could that be considered tacit approval? It seemed unlikely, but it was a possibility that crossed my mind. Could the FBI argue that, because I hadn't explicitly stopped them, they had some sort of right to continue using my property for these exercises? It seemed absurd, but given how things had unfolded, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. The fact that the FBI was willing to operate in such a clandestine manner without giving a second thought to notifying me made me question whether there were indeed legal loopholes they could hide behind. Another angle the FBI could take was claiming national security or operational necessity. The government sometimes justifies its actions with broad arguments about safety or the need to act quickly, especially when dealing with sensitive training programs. The use of private property for these exercises could, in their view, be seen as necessary to ensure agents are fully prepared for real-life threats. From this standpoint, they might argue that it's in the public's best interest, despite the inconvenience or harm it might cause to individual property owners. And with this justification, they might not feel the need to be transparent or seek permission, because in their eyes, the greater good is at stake. But this doesn't mean the FBI's actions are beyond reproach. If this kind of operation can be carried out without proper checks and balances, without oversight or respect for the property rights of citizens, it opens the door to more widespread abuse. If agencies like the FBI are allowed to freely use private property without the consent of the owner, it creates a dangerous precedent. It weakens the protections in place for citizens. It makes people like me feel powerless, trapped in a system where the very rights we rely on can be overruled by a government agency that answers to no one. So, while I was left grappling with the potential legal action I could take, it was clear that this was more than just a violation of property. It was a violation of trust. The ethical and legal ramifications went far beyond my own situation. They affected everyone who lived in this country, everyone whose home could one day become the FBI's next training ground, with no warning, no permission, and no accountability. The days after the incident felt like a blur, but one thing was painfully clear. Nothing would ever be the same. The world I had once known, the quiet neighborhood, the comfort of my own home, had been shattered in an instant. Every corner of my life was affected by what had happened. My sense of safety, my peace of mind, everything was upended. The realization that my own home had been used as a training ground without my consent left me feeling violated in ways I couldn't explain. I couldn't just go back to normal after what I'd experienced. The fear lingered, creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected times. Every noise, every unfamiliar car passing by made me tense. I couldn't look at my front door without remembering how it had been kicked down, the sound of the wood splintering echoing in my mind. The silence in my house felt oppressive now. Every empty room seemed like a reminder of the invasion, a reminder that I had no control over what had happened. I couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was at play, and I was just a small piece in an operation I didn't understand. The tension in my relationships with neighbors grew palpable. Karen, of course, was the first to act strange when I saw her after the incident. I wasn't sure what to expect from her, but it didn't take long for me to realize that she was not the neighbor I thought she was. She avoided eye contact, and when we did speak, it was always short, almost forced. Her usual passive-aggressive tone was gone, replaced with a strange coldness. It was as if she knew something I didn't, but she wasn't ready to share it. Or maybe she was just trying to distance herself from the whole mess. The air between us became thick with suspicion, and I found myself wondering how much she really knew. Was she involved in all of this? Had she been watching the whole thing unfold and said nothing? I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had been more than just an innocent bystander, but the more I thought about it, the less clear everything became. I was left with more questions than answers, and every encounter with her made me feel like I was unraveling. But it wasn't just Karen. The entire neighborhood began to feel different. The faces that used to greet me with warm smiles now carried an undercurrent of unease. People were talking, whispering, wondering who would be next. Word had gotten out. No one could keep something like this quiet, especially when the FBI was involved. Residents started looking over their shoulders more, locking their doors a little tighter at night. The sense of community we'd once shared had been replaced with a fear that seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Everyone was asking the same questions. Was it safe to live here? Could the FBI come to their homes next? Who would be next on the list? No one knew what had happened to me. No one knew about the live fire exercises that had taken place on my property. But everyone could feel the ripple effect, and soon the fear began to spread throughout the entire block. People were starting to wonder if their homes could become targets for a government agency without warning. It wasn't just about my experience anymore. It was about the security of everyone's home, everyone's private space. How could we trust that something like this wouldn't happen again? As the days passed, the anger inside me started to grow. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just sit idly by. The truth needed to come out. I wasn't just going to let the FBI, and possibly Karen, get away with this. There had to be consequences for their actions, and I was determined to make sure my story was heard. But where to start? Who would listen? I knew I wasn't the only one feeling this way. Others in the community were scared, and if they knew what had really happened, maybe they'd be as outraged as I was. Maybe they'd want to take action too. I thought about going to the news, sharing my story with the public, but the idea of exposing everything, the fear of backlash, it felt overwhelming. What would the FBI do if I spoke out? Would they try to silence me? But then I remembered the look on the faces of the neighbors when they looked at me. They were scared, and so was I. We were all living in a state of constant fear and uncertainty, and I couldn't just let that continue. Something needed to change. This wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It was about the rights of every citizen to feel safe in their own home. If I didn't speak out, who would? The anger inside me began to feel like fuel. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not now. Not after everything I had been through. I couldn't live in fear anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my property, it was about a bigger issue. The abuse of power by government agencies. The idea that the FBI could just show up on private land without explanation or permission was something I couldn't accept. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It had the potential to happen to anyone, anywhere. I had to take action. For my own peace of mind, for the safety of my community, and for the protection of every homeowner out there who didn't know what could be happening behind their backs. It was time to speak up. The days turned into weeks, and I found myself at a crossroads. Part of me wanted to take immediate action, to file a lawsuit, to expose the FBI and anyone involved in this violation of my rights. I wanted to stand up and scream from the rooftops about what had happened, to make sure no one else would have to endure what I went through. But another part of me, the part that had been scared into silence after seeing the military-like precision of the operation, wondered what would happen if I did speak out. Would it just make everything worse? Would I become a target too? The fear of retaliation, of facing down an agency with seemingly unlimited power, gnawed at me every time I thought about going public. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone in the community, everyone who could be unknowingly pulled into something like this. I could see it in their eyes. My neighbors were just as scared as I was. Karen, with all her strange behavior and her strange involvement, was just one part of the bigger puzzle. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were more pieces I hadn't uncovered yet. More people who had been affected by the FBI's operations without even knowing it. But as the weeks passed, I started to understand something else too. Maybe there wasn't any easy way to fix what had happened. Maybe some things were beyond our control. I wasn't going to let this define me, let this incident consume every waking moment. There were still questions that haunted me. The mystery behind Karen's involvement, the question of how many others were in the dark about similar situations, but at some point I had to accept that I couldn't change everything. The world didn't work the way I thought it did. Justice wasn't always guaranteed. The system wasn't perfect. But maybe, just maybe, I could do my part by making sure this story wasn't swept under the rug, by making sure that other people knew that they weren't alone. Karen's role in all of this, as strange and troubling as it was, remained a mystery. Was she just an unknowing participant, a neighbor who had been roped into something far bigger than herself? Or had she been actively working with the FBI, feeding them information, watching everything unfold from the sidelines? I still couldn't answer that. I couldn't explain the coldness in her eyes when we spoke after the incident, nor could I explain why she had seemed so eager to distance herself from me. Had she been complicit in the operation, or was she just as much a pawn as I was? I didn't know, and at times I found myself wondering if I ever would. The bigger question, though, lingered on my mind. How many others were there, just like me, who had been caught up in situations they didn't even know about? How many people were living in homes that had been secretly used for these live fire exercises without ever being told? It wasn't just about my story anymore. It was about all of us. The potential for abuse of power, the risk of innocent people being put in harm's way without their knowledge. This wasn't an isolated incident. It could happen anywhere, to anyone. The thought made me uneasy, knowing that so many people had no idea what could be happening right beneath their feet. In the end, I didn't know what would happen next. Would the FBI ever be held accountable? Would Karen ever be forced to explain her role in everything? Or would this just fade into the background? Another story of government overreach that people would forget as soon as the headlines faded? There was so much uncertainty, so much left unanswered. But one thing was certain. I couldn't just let this go. Maybe I couldn't change everything, but I could make sure that I, at least, had the answers I deserved. And maybe in the process, I could help others find their own answers too. The future felt uncertain. I didn't know what kind of repercussions I'd face for speaking out, or if I'd ever be able to get the justice I wanted. But as I looked around at my community, at the neighbors who had been left in the dark just as I had, I realized that the battle wasn't over. It wasn't just about one home, one door kicked down, or one violation of privacy. It was about everyone who had been unknowingly caught in the crossfire, everyone who had a right to know what was really happening behind closed doors. And maybe in time, I could help uncover that truth. Or maybe, just maybe, we could all start asking the questions that needed to be asked.